I did it again, and I'm sorry. Trying to. I guess I'm stressing too much, and I shouldn't. But I'm worried about your time. Um, so I did it again. So this will be part three. But it develops outside the universities. Humanism does, and as I've already said, the focus of the new subjects were poetry, literature, history, and ethics, and language I've already mentioned. Now, when we get to the 16th century, you say, well, isn't this just a literary device? It's like, are we saying that we should all just study literature? No, this is about biblical scholarship. It's about ethics. It's about morality, morals. And it has a real impact, and language can have a real impact. Erasmus of Rotterdam was referred to as the Prince of the Humanists. Early 16th century, late 15th, early 16th century. He had studied in Italy a bit. He was a wandering scholar. He was actually an Augustinian canon officially. The canons were not the hermits. So keep that in mind. He was not an Augustinian hermit. Luther was an Augustinian hermit. Erasmus was technically an Augustinian canon, not a very good one, but that's another story. And he was Dutch, tying into this from of Rotterdam, Erasmus of Rotterdam, this Devotio Moderna aspect and the Jordan aspect, and on we go. And Erasmus and Luther were in great conflict. Erasmus, too, was very critical of the institutional church, but he did not break from it. He wrote an anonymous treatise because he didn't want to get himself in too much trouble. It was called Julius Exclusus. Julius II was Pope in the early 16th century, led armies into battle and everything else. And this is a satire, which was a good classical form. The Erasmus writes, as Julius dies, goes up to heaven, meets St. Peter, and Julius says, "Here I am, Peter, I'm ready to come in." And Peter says, "No, you're not getting in here. You're going to hell." And Julius says, "Wait, I'm Pope." He goes, "I don't care if you're Pope, you're going to hell." Julius Exclusus was Julius excluded from hell, or from heaven, sorry, excluded from heaven. Everyone knew it was Erasmus, but it was anonymous, so you could kind of feign, wasn't me. Um, but he did a number of other things. He was into classical scholarship, and he also then felt that the Bible needed a new translation. Now, the Bible in Latin had been translated by Jerome, and this became the common translation was that of Jerome. And the common in Latin is Vulgate, Vulgata. Biblia Vulgata is the common Bible, but it became known in English as the Vulgate, and that was Jerome's translation. And Jerome was an outstanding scholar. He was an outstanding, also Ciceronian scholar of Latin, of Cicero. This is 4th century um, CE. But Erasmus thought it doesn't really go well enough with the Greek and Hebrew. So I'm going to start and I'm going to do a new translation of the New Testament. And then he goes and works on an Old Testament translation. But his Novum Instrumentum was a new translation in parallel commons of Greek and Latin, and a couple of very controversial translations. I'm just going to talk about one of them in the Gospel of John. Gospel of John. I think I may have already mentioned this earlier on, um, which begins in Latin, in principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. And there we go. That verbum, word with a capital W, was this metaphysical word. It was part of the Trinitarian theology at the time. And Erasmus said, no, the Greek, the logos in Greek doesn't mean verbum, this metaphysical word. It means the spoken word. We have the logos, we have the pathos. Rhetorical terms, whatever. The logos is kind of the structure of the spoken, the argument, and the pathos is the emotion involvement. And the logos is not verbum, it is sermo. Sermo is also means word. It's the basis of our word sermon, sermo, but it's the spoken word. And Erasmus says theologically it works because how did God create the world? Let's go back to Genesis. Genesis 1:1. In principio erat Deus. No, in principio creavit Deus caelum et terra. How did he do it? Et Deus dixit. Fiat lux. And God said, let there be light. God spoke. That was the power of the word of God, was the spoken word. So Erasmus is saying, I'm going to translate John 1:1 not as in principio erat verbum, but as in principio erat sermo. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. But that little translation change was very controversial. I mean, if you, and I'm not assuming anybody has a church background. If you do, if you may have come across issues of translation problems. Growing up, where I did, I knew people who were, thought, well, this one poor old man thought that the King James version of the Bible was actually what God had actually dictated, and so even didn't even like the Revised Standard Version. That's messing with things. Translations can get very problematic if we start changing them. That's what was going on here too. It becomes also then just as the textual criticism of the classical text. So the biblical criticism is arising too, saying what is the text actually meaning? We have to go back to the Greek and then to the Hebrew and try to find out and see that it's not always the same, and there's an issue and a problem. And all of these things together led to, north of the Alps, these developments of circles, humanist circles or sodalitates, where the humanities would be studied, especially with regard to biblical scholarship and things, because I've already said it wasn't part of the universities. So there's this dual educational structure, and they're trying to get the humanities into the universities. The humanities are resisting. The whole idea is we need to bring about a reformation of the universities. That's what was going on too at this time, and that was what Luther was part of, because the term Reformation in the early 16th century also included the reformation of universities, which was the reformation of the curriculum to include the humanities within the curriculum. And Luther was leading the movement to get the University of Wittenberg to reform their curriculum and to offer Greek. And he was able to do so. And in 1518, the first professor of Greek was appointed at Wittenberg, and it was a man by the name of Philip Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon was the nephew of Johannes Reuchlin, who was a very famous humanist, northern German humanist, was involved in an affair, a controversy over the study of Hebrew, and with Greek as well. They wanted to get him, and he said, "No, I'm too old. I'm not really interested, but my nephew is really good, Philip Schwarz-Erd, Philippus Schwarz-Erd. You should hire him." And Philip Schwarz-Erd was born in 1500, so he was 18 years old. And he comes and he wowed people. He wowed Luther through and through. He changed his name, not didn't change his name, but he made it into Greek. Schwarzerd in German is black earth, and Melanchthon in Greek is black earth. And so Philip Melanchthon, even his name became this humanistic approach to saying, this is who I am. I'm the professor of Greek. He and Luther became bosom buddies, and Melanchthon became Luther's right-hand man. Melanchthon